Y bueno, gracias a todo el mundo, a todos los que habéis venido, por volver a un seminario presencial. Como ha dicho Leticia, hacía tiempo que no hemos hecho alguna actividad, pero más pequeñita. Esta es la vez que más gente juntamos en 2 años y pico. Nuestro anterior seminario, para quienes lo estuvierais o lo hayáis visto por internet, se llamó Tiempo que ganar y acabó el 20 y pico de febrero de 2020, o sea, como muy al límite del fin del mundo. Entonces, bueno, pues entre medias ha pasado mucho tiempo, han pasado muchas cosas y bueno, queríamos volver a este tipo de actividades. El anterior seminario fuera Tiempo que ganar nos ponía muy fácil el nombre para este segundo, Espacio que ganar, porque creemos que el espacio va a ser una dimensión fundamental en la lucha por una transición ecológica justa. En el espacio vivimos, en el espacio nos movemos, en el espacio bueno, pues es donde desarrollamos nuestras vidas y también es un territorio de disputa, que cada vez va a serlo más, ya sea por las renovables, ya sea por los alimentos que producimos, ya sea simplemente por dónde queremos y cómo son las ciudades, los pueblos que queremos vivir. Así que bueno, vamos a dedicar unas semanas, son 7 sesiones, a hablar del espacio en varias de sus derivadas. Voy a leerlas para no equivocarme con las fechas, porque son todos los martes, menos una que es un lunes. Las sesiones son el Estado de la cuestión, que tenemos hoy a Richard Seymour, del que hablaré brevemente ahora. La semana que viene hablaremos de energías renovables, transición energética, renovables sí, pero así, problematizando un poco cómo está siendo la transición. Después hablaremos, ASA vendrá el 17 de mayo, Martín Layana, y también tendremos con nosotros a gente de Ecooo para que nos cuente un poco más de lo que han mencionado. Luego hablaremos del futuro del transporte con Carmen Dulce y Pablo Muñoz, el 24 de mayo, también martes. El 31 de mayo, nosotros contra el diluvio hablaremos del uso de la tierra y el uso de los animales, un tema muy, muy peliagudo y muy interesante. Luego vendrá Pedro Glad, que es asesor de Gabriel Boric en Chile, a hablar el lunes 6 de junio de imperialismo climático. Volvemos al martes, el 14 de junio, con James Medway sobre finanzas climáticas. Y acabaremos con una charla, debate entre Violeta Garrido y Emilio Santiago, y también participará alguien de Contra el Diluvio sobre qué hacer el día 21 de junio. Y en principio esto será lo que tendremos. Y sin más dilación, presento a Richard Seymour, a quien tenemos la suerte de tener hoy con nosotros. Thank you for coming here, Richard. Richard es un escritor y ensayista del norte de Irlanda que ha escrito desde hace años sobre temas de actualidades políticas en Reino Unido principalmente. Es editor y miembro del colectivo que publica la revista Salvage. Sus últimos libros son The Twitter Machine, sobre nuestra vida como usuarios y clientes de redes sociales, y The Disenchanted Earth, que está aquí, que es un libro en el que, mediante ensayos breves, aborda el cambio climático y la crisis de biodiversidad desde varios puntos de vista, y en el que más o menos se va narrando su viaje como metiéndose en el estudio y la lucha contra el cambio climático. Hemos querido contar con él para esta sesión inaugural porque su forma de mirar al mundo, que está entre la maravilla y la aceptación de que hay una cierta pérdida inevitable y con la que tenemos que vivir, nos parece muy valiosa para situarnos en este inicio del curso. Así que, sin más dilación, damos inicio al seminario. Thank you, Richard.
Gracias. I want to say some things to you about work, war, capital, and nature. And I'll start with the fact that some of you will have doubtless seen that one of the last holdouts against Russian imperialism in that defiled city of Mariupol is being staged from the Azovstal iron and steel works. This plant, an icon of fossil Stalinism, was formed in 1930 as part of a drive to industrialize the Soviet Union. It was and remains to this day one of the largest sources of pollution in Ukraine. A corporate city capable of holding 12,000 families at its peak, it was also built with an underground city of bunkers and tunnels because it was intended to be a frontier of future wars. And so it was. During the Nazi occupation, aided of course by a convivial Ukrainian nationalist movement, the Third Reich put the labour force to work producing ammunition. Today, the plant, owned by Ukrainian oligarchs, has been converted to support the defensive war of the Ukrainian government. Now, it is that shady interface, the dead zone where the factory becomes a battleground, that I want us to think about. Think of the mass worker toiling for war, producing war at the biomic boundaries of capitalism. Think of the uncanny valleys of World War I. The organic composition of capital, as Marx called it, is always a matter of steel and guts. The assembly line tedium of the trenches, followed by storms of steel, shell blasts, live burials, hallucinations, the walking death, proletarian bodies possessed in the middle of no man's land. The mass production of war, insanely production of insanity, of exploded realities, of subaltern psychoses. Fascism would technologize this psychosis to produce a cyborg, a man of steel. Its race war footing, a footling cybernetic offensive, internment by punch card with the assistance of IBM, violently adjusting the organic composition of the nation. The prestidigitization of capitalism, its deep fake of automation, its pretense that it can dispense with living labor, no sweat, no emissions in the pristine cloud, was in the first instance a precipitate of war. Fascism pulverized the mass worker by nationalizing it. Post-industrialism instead sought to dissipate it into a planetary vapor. What's in the post is hyper-industrialism. Of the 100 largest multinationals today, 4/5 make their money from manufacturing, and even now are exploring the horizons opened by machine learning, gene sequencing, biotechnology, 3D printing, and digital manufacturing for possible new value seams. The annual production of automobiles today is almost 3 times larger than it was at the beginning of the 1970s. The extraction of minerals has more than tripled in that period, while oil production has increased by 75%. World exports in mining and construction machinery is soaring even faster, trebling in the decade between 2002 and 2012 alone. Today's industrial foundries in Hsinchu, Hyderabad, Ciudad Juarez, and Shenzhen are of unprecedented scale, working continuously at speed. Mining operations are global in scale. Martin Arboleda speaks of a planetary mine. Each step in the extraction process is supervised and connected by artificial intelligences leveraging big data. Automated trucks, drills, shovels, locomotives, generations of networked robots and vehicles, all road tested in war, have been dispatched to the front lines of production and the class struggle. Robots work in the dark without brakes. Human knowledge is appropriated so that yesterday's esteemed high-paid knowledge workers are today's robots. This is the knowledge economy. Capital's spontaneous fantasy, in a Landian twist, referring here to Nick Land, is to be liberated from humanity. The fetishism, this fetishism, paraphilia in the psychiatric jargon, technologizes omnipotence wishes. That is, the fetish object, the technical apparatus, guarantees that the Earth Mother's body is always there when needed. The fetishistic logic of seeing and unseeing is exemplified in the image of the cloud, which obscures the actual trajectory of cybernetic capital, which is a global expansion of both the human workforce and the reserve army, an expansion of both human and robot in ever more convoluted value chains. The mass worker is thus decomposed, its parts exploded and distributed to new peripheries, from Foxconn to Amazon warehouses to the Tesla Gigafactory. Automation, not just of work, but of the grammar of capital itself, is a preemptive industrial action. Mobile phones absorbed millions of informal workers as de facto employees of the formal sector. Smartphones lubricate financialization, further scaling down, standardizing, and precaritizing work. The app economy and its cognates leveraging the expanded digital extraction of coltan, gold, and other minerals for the most efficient networking of value. Never before was so much surplus labor available. Never were so many inside the knot, as the writer Ursula Hughes puts it, of production. The world market batters down all walls, including the walls of sleep, for a 24/7 economy. So, on the decomposing body of the mass worker, which had hosted symbiotic workerist cultures, arise new biotechnical cultures which accelerate the decomposition. The residual formations of the nationalized mass worker find meaning and social life in digital enclaves where fascist propaganda flourishes. Young, networked proletarians build lives in online telecontinents built for ruthless competition, commodification, and precarious existence. Even the gilded tech brotherhoods succumb. Gamergate being a gendered displacement of a capital-labor antagonism intensified by digital Taylorism. Cybernetic capital produces a global mass of knowledge workers with standardized qualifications. Software giants like Microsoft have produced a flurry of certificates which can be held by millions of digital workers from Detroit to Delhi, while the educational policies of the World Bank and the European Union have sought to create a reserve army of digitally literate workers. All literacies entail illiteracy somewhere. The digitally literate worker, as far as education can manage, is class illiterate. As the fourth machine age seeks a new organic composition of capital, and as the limits of neoliberalism are clearly being reached, cybernetic capital's statist predicates are becoming more apparent. The new statism, a fusion of big data, energy giants, pharmaceuticals, finance, manufacturing, national treasuries and central banks, is not the same as the old Fordism, though it leverages a certain ethnic memory of the mass worker, not as an exploited group, but as a group of people robbed of its ethnic status and industrial pride by a politically correct elite. This is the white working class. It can't be Fordism, because Fordism only worked by not being universal. The high wages of the imperial core had to be were matched by Jim Crow wage rolls on the old energy frontiers from the Panama Canal to Aramco, the oil company in Saudi Arabia. The new digital worker is internationalized, hyper-connected within a nested series of hierarchies, linking child mine workers in the Congo to menial digital laborers in San Francisco to Uber drivers in London. Since the networking of production is set up to disrupt, not facilitate, occupational solidarities across borders, the new digital proletariat often composes itself in online relations where the vectors of politicization are both managed and unmanageable. The digital proletariat through online life building works to produce what is called a data double. The data double works for the other side. It stages your desire algorithmically, like the doppelganger of Hans Ewer's student of Prague. In Ewer's story, you encounter your double on the rebound, doubling back. He has been to the scene of the duel. He has killed the adversary you had sworn to forgive. He has staged your desire in the forest of big data, and in so doing, has supplied the bureaucracies with the information about you necessary to decide whether you can have debt, parole, medical treatment, or a job. Micromanagement seeps into everyday life, blurring the lines between life and work, production and consumption, waking and sleeping. From punch card to data cloud, you are known, determinate, predictable, manageable, an exploding cluster of data points. Or does it explode? Even a general intelligence can't regulate the way of the unconscious, any more than a general energetics can free capital of living labor, or release it or us from the rebound, the doubling back of the carbon cloud. and the murders it is even now readying. The planetary scale of capital's operations is measured by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. 42% of all historical cumulative CO2 emissions were emitted between 1990 and 2019. Emissions jumped 12% between 2010 and 2019, which is the highest decadal increase on record. Much of this increase is ascribed to urbanization, and that can partly be read as a proxy for rapid capitalist development in rising nations like China, which, despite its small share of historic emissions, accounted for a third of all annual emissions in 2021. Based on the continuation of policies implemented by world governments by the end of 2020, the planet will likely have warmed 3.2 degrees by 2100. On a planet 3.2 degrees warmer than in the pre-industrial era, 49% of insects, 44% of plants, and 26% of vertebrates are at risk of extinction. The temperature could exceed 4 degrees on two conditions. Either renewable technology is abandoned and mitigation policies junked, as per the preferences of the denialist, as in nihilist, far right, or climate sensitivity is just higher than current estimates acknowledge. Those are two appallingly plausible scenarios. Parenthetically, the last time the planet was 4 degrees warmer than pre-industrial temperatures was 15 million years ago, when the ice caps didn't exist. Sea levels were 40 meters higher than today, and currently 145 million people live a mere 3 feet or less above sea level. The policy response following this report, which was the latest report, was immediate. In the United States, President Biden committed himself to drastically increasing the rate of domestic oil and gas production. In the United Kingdom, the government committed itself to increasing extraction of oil and gas from the North Sea. China, which is building about half of the world's new coal-fired power plants, cut tariffs on coal imports. The context for this outburst of 70s-style energy nationalism is first contained in the story of Mariupol that I began with. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, mobilizing apocalyptic nationalism. Think about that joke which Putin has told about destroying the world in a nuclear holocaust, because what is a world without Russia good for? Has reanimated dying Cold War ideologies in the West and consolidated NATO. Yet it also indexes Washington's relative decline. The dollar hit its lowest historical share of global currency reserves at the end of 2021, months after Biden's ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan. But it also responds to growing strains on global supply chains and energy production, in part arising from ecological blowback in the form of wild energy. What do I mean by wild energy? Take one example, the 2020 floods in China. During the floods, the flow of water in the Three Gorges Dam peaked at 75,000 cubic meters per second, an amount of water capable in those conditions of producing 37,029 kilowatt hours of electricity. Well over 10 times the amount of electricity consumed by the average person on the planet in 2019. That much loose energy firing around wildly, turned back against human civilization, resulted in hundreds of deaths, 54,000 house collapses, and property damage estimated at 32 billion. You can perform similar calculations for hurricanes, storms, wildfires. The winds in a single hurricane would generate 1.3 times 10 to the power of 17 joules of energy in a day, which is about half the planet's generating capacity. The average heat energy released by the annual western wildfires in the United States is estimated at 1.4 times 10 to the power of 18 joules, or 1.4 million terajoules, which is roughly how much energy the planet has consumed commercially today. But of course, that's the old normal. In the new normal, as of 2020, the heat energy released by the burning would be 5.6 times 10 to the power of 18 joules, or 5.6 million terajoules, which is enough to power the planet for 4 days. Wild energy is an industrial byproduct. It is comparable to what Jason W. Moore calls negative value. It is a yield from a capitalist investment whose result is intensified storms, floods, and wildfires, making the extraction of fossil energy, materials, and human caloric energy harder and more expensive. Hence inflation without improving living standards, hence relative stagnation, hence the sharpening of geopolitical conflict as the stakes increase. Ecological blowback, an explosive rebound, threatens to arrive in other forms. Mass extinction will not be peaceful, not for the apex predator on the planet, balanced precariously on top of a collapsing food chain. Ocean acidification and the consequences of overfishing will not be peaceful, certainly not if rising sea levels fill the Mekong Delta with salt water, killing off one of the world's most productive ecosystems, destroying the rice fields, and ending the abundant supply of freshwater fish that feeds 14 million people. The erosion of soil fertility and consequent decline in the quality and quantity of food available, even eventually to consumers in Western supermarkets, will not be peaceful. Capitalism means increasingly a networked fascism, a distributed fascism. The materials for the cyborg, the man of steel, are already here, smeared out across networks of computing devices, each surveilling the other, each surveyed by millions of others. And all of that means war. That's it.
Thank you very much. Pues vamos a abrir ahora turno de preguntas e intervenciones. La idea es que idealmente podemos debatir unos con otros. Será interesante que Richard opine, pero bueno, que si alguien tiene algo que quiere responder a otra persona, ahí está. Así que si alguien quiere tomar la primera palabra. ¿Nadie quiere hablar? Él no cuenta. Nadie que no sea contra el diluvio quiere hablar, porque si no habla contra el diluvio. ¿Vale? Pues.
Bueno, gracias por la charla. Mientras hablo, espero que alguien se anime a participar también. Yo por ahora solo quiero preguntar o comentar sobre uno de los muchos temas que has intentado entremezclar en tu exposición, es la globalización del capital, ¿no? La globalización efectiva, y cómo hay una cierta estandarización de los trabajadores y las trabajadoras a nivel mundial, tanto en habilidades como en los trabajos que desarrollan. Si no recuerdo mal, ¿no?, el manifiesto comunista terminaba con esto de trabajadores de todos los países unidos, hace ya más de 150 años, y siempre ha quedado como una especie de aspiración, creo yo. Muy pocas veces ha estado cerca de ser efectivo, pero cuando se escribió era también una aspiración para el capitalismo, creo yo, ¿no? Porque el capitalismo existía en 3 o 4 sitios y poco más, y ahora sí que es una realidad esa globalización, creo. El capital, aunque sigue enfrentado y ¿no?, resquebrajado internamente, yo creo que está globalizado. Entonces mi pregunta, y entiendo que es este tipo de pregunta que es muy difícil de contestar de forma concreta, específica o útil, ¿no?, pero bueno, igual como pie para una reflexión o para un debate, si piensas que hoy en día es posible que esta globalización del capital y del trabajo, esta, ¿no?, unión objetiva de las personas trabajadoras en todo el mundo, o casi todo el mundo, permite, por una parte, que haya cierto tipo de organización a nivel mundial para luchar tanto contra el capital como contra el cambio climático, en la medida que haya una diferencia entre esas dos cosas, y si es necesario que exista ese tipo de unión realmente para para poder, ¿no?, vencer en esta lucha, o si es solo algo que va a seguir siendo como una aspiración y algo, ¿no?, a lo que aspirar, pero no algo que exista realmente.
Shall I just go ahead and answer? To get to the point directly, just look at the world and in terms of world politics today. The dominant trends, as we've seen, Trump, Bolsonaro, Narendra Modi, Rodrigo Duterte, and his successor Bongbong Marcos, the son of a dictator, Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, these are the rising forces. Nationalism in ways that are not entirely contrary to the established order of neoliberalism, but are contrary to the globalized institutional apparatus. New nationalist forces are arising, and it's worth asking why that is. I think just in terms of the general sort of counterposition that you pointed out there, you talk about the globalization of labor, but on the other hand, the globalization of capital. It seems to me that the globalization of capital structurally is set up to disrupt the globalization of labor. And I don't think that's just because of, mean businessmen and capitalists and so on who want to keep the workers apart. I think it's because capital, in order to globalize, as Ellen Meaksons Woods has documented, relies upon the nation state and always has. At the height of globalization, it was the nation states that were driving the process, that were the legal actors in the process, that were providing the bailouts. Well before the big bailouts in 2008, they were bailing out, savings and loans and private equity funds. So the nation state has always been really important. Then, of course, there's the nation state's importance for regulating the flows of labor in terms of borders. So in the United States, notoriously, big business doesn't necessarily oppose flows of migrant labor. What they oppose is it being too easy. They don't want it to be too secure, because then you know your rights, then you can get represented by a union. They want it to be just so that you could get busted by ICE any day. So you keep your head down and you shut your mouth and you get to work. And so that's, I think there's something of that structure built in. But I think also, on top of that, when you've got a neoliberal world system, basically evolved over 40 years, in which the stakes of failure drastically increased, because of the slopes of inequality increased, and also because there came with that an emulous culture of glorifying celebrity bosses. Donald Trump was one of them. Remember on The Apprentice? That the libidinal high of the Apprentice was he would point at you and say, "You're fired." And we're all supposed to go, "Oh," that was supposed to be the enjoyable moment, but that was neoliberal culture to a T. And so built into neoliberalism was both glorification of the rich and sadism towards the poor, punishment for failure. And so, failure is always difficult, but it became politically toxic. So I want you to look at this. In the 6th of January or 6th of February 2021, I can't remember which month it was, the riots in Capitol building in Washington, D.C., there was some research done into the participants, and they found that the majority of them were not organized in militias or organized in far-right gangs or whatever. The majority of them were basically members of the downwardly mobile bourgeoisie. And by bourgeoisie, I don't mean ruling class proper, I mean professionals, sort of people who had run their own small businesses and things like that. A lot of them were had done quite well, had been very affluent in boom years, and had plummeted. And you see that pattern everywhere. Everywhere resentful nationalism flourishes, you can see that it flourishes among those who have experienced a downward class trajectory. And most importantly, their downward class trajectory is linked to an experience of regional decline, of neglect. And so they might be considered quite notable in their area, even if they don't belong to the ruling class proper. And then their area goes through decline, they experience relative decline with it. Even if they're not the poorest, that experience of decline feeds this toxic emotion, and what the theologian, I forget his name, sorry, but he referred to concept of the underground resentments and the ethos of the existential revenge. You know, I suffer, I'm going to make somebody else suffer for it, and it's going to restore my ontological self-confidence. Okay, so in that context, the nation state has become more powerful than it has been for a long time in ideological terms, which is a strange thing if you think about it. The nation state's it's a political abstraction. You know, we're told everybody's into bread and butter issues. That's all people care about, bread and butter, you know. They care about what's in their wallets. Suddenly it turns out people care about mad things like flags and, you know, nationality. Abstractions matter a lot. Ideology matters a lot. So the fact that in the moments of crisis, when capital's, you know, in the interstices of capital's sort of crisis, the fact that what results is not anti-capitalism, but a kind of, if you like, a displacement of anti-capitalism in the form of nationalism, xenophobia, and so on. That isn't necessarily, that, you know, that isn't you know, mandated by history or something, but it is constant enough in the history of capitalism, ever since the sort of Bonapartist era of 1848 and so on, that it suggests that there's something structural to capitalism, that it keeps throwing up this form of politics as a way of dealing with its modes of crisis. But it's also partly contingent on the fact that the left has been absolutely hammered for 40 years and we're just starting to recover. That's the best way I can answer your question. I don't think I've answered it.
Si no tiene preguntas, yo tengo una pregunta. Pero os animamos a que preguntéis. Que no... además, como veis, se puede preguntar en castellano y luego se traduce, o sea, es mejor todavía. Mi pregunta está relacionada, estaba pensando en la globalización. Uno de los primeros trabajos globalizados que existió fue el de marinero, ¿no? Como los marineros viajaban de un puerto a otro. Esto lo explica Marcus Rediker en sus historias, no me acuerdo cómo se llama, en castellano es, no me acuerdo cómo se llama. Es uno de los primeros trabajos globalizados en el que innovaciones laborales iban de un sitio a otro del planeta, de Europa, América, África, y también hubo la primera resistencia globalizada, digamos, a la opresión del capital, fue la piratería, gente que decidía salirse de ese mercado laboral que tenía unas condiciones pésimas. Y estaba pensando en una cosa que ocurre mucho cuando vemos noticias de otros países. Cuando vemos noticias de Estados Unidos, del Green New Deal, y es todo maravilloso. Cuando vemos noticias de los planes de Corbyn para la nueva industrialización verde en Reino Unido, es maravilloso. Y luego lees, por ejemplo, pasan a Planet to Win, un libro de Kate Arnoff, Daniel Dana Cohen, Thierry Franco y Elisa Battistoni, que ponían como ejemplo de una transición ecológica verde la que estaba proponiendo el Partido Socialista en España. Los que estamos en España, pues, y conocemos el Partido Socialista Español, sabemos que no es precisamente una adalid de la transición ecológica y no es alguien de que pueda fiarte. Pero me pregunto si eso tiene una cierta validez ideológicamente, ese pensar en, mira qué bien lo están haciendo allí, vamos a hacerlo como ellos. Aunque si miras con detalle veas que no es tan cierto como podías pensar. Pero eso le sirvió de ejemplo a Battistoni y coautores para contar su historia. Igual que a nosotros nos vale decir, mira el plan de estímulo de Biden, qué maravilloso es, aunque luego preguntas a cualquier estadounidense de izquierdas y diga, esto no vale para nada, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué se puede sacar de ahí? Si se puede construir algún tipo de nuevo internacionalismo a partir de confusiones y de engaños entre militantes de izquierdas de un país y otro.
I think I know the book you're talking about, the Marcus Rediker book. You're referring to The Many-Headed Hydra, which is a great book. And I would say that if you want to look at examples of where internationalism is almost built into working class experience, today it would be the Dockers. And international docking workers unions have been very much in the forefront of internationalism, locking together. And that's quite a powerful thing in the era of supply chain crises, and in the era of, obviously lengthening supply chains has been an issue, but even in the era of sort of deglobalization, such as we're seeing now, those groups of workers are going to be quite important. Politically, and in terms of the imaginaries that you're talking about, the way in which a concept like the Green New Deal fires around the world, again, I think we're talking about these online telecontinents. It's weird because we seem to have different levels of political imagination. Nationalism thrives, but it thrives in the very same enclaves, which are basically massive continents of people who don't share a nation state. Well, the Green New Deal, where does it begin? As far as I know, the Green New Deal begins with some, the ideas of some sort of mildly left Keynesian economists in the United Kingdom, and is then picked up by a variety of other forces. And at that time, it doesn't have any particular, it hasn't really dealt with the problems of how are you going to secure rare metals. That's a huge question, because that could be secured by plunder, neo-colonialism, etc. That involves indigenous peoples who are quite important to any future climate settlement. Wasn't talked about. So the Green New Deal began as something quite limited, and then it expanded in its horizons, and it now means any number of things. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, claims to support a Green New Deal. Nothing like what even someone like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez talks about, which is, is okay, but it's fairly national and parochial. Is there a new internationalism possible? I think one shouldn't bullshit in these situations. The answer is I don't know. How could I possibly? But I have been around long enough politically to remember what internationalism felt like when we had the social forums, the World Social Forums, the European Social Forums, when we had the international anti-war movement and its, the Cairo Declaration, when we had even something, like the movement against third world debt, which had a sort of paternalistic white savior edge to it, but nonetheless, it was about internationalism. We've retreated from that in recent years as people have sort of decided they got rather important issues with their own ruling classes to fight out. But I hope that we can rebuild it around climate, because one thing we know for sure about climate change and ecological destruction is that the solutions can't be national by definition. Last night I was doing an event and somebody raised Kim Stanley Robinson's suggestion that, look, if you're in the global south and these rich countries are driving you to ruin because they're overheating the planet, they're polluting the oceans, you're being left with very few resources. What the hell? I mean, you may as well turn to geoengineering. Why don't you just use solar radiation management and pump some sulfate particles into the air and protect yourself from all that heat? It would make perfect sense. And of course that's true. That's the incentive that the rich countries, or the capitalist class in the rich countries, is setting up. Of course, it's totally untenable. It would be very dangerous, and it would potentially lead to huge ecological blowback. And it's a sort of nationalist logic. So how do we escape from that nationalist logic? We've got to build, I come from a Trotskyist background, and we're always talking about building things. Build the Revolutionary Party. I mean, we're a bit past that now, obviously, but build is a sort of vacuous term, but I don't know how else to put it. Only that it tells us that there is a job of painstaking construction to be done, and tenuous networks to be built up. But the one thing we do have in our favor is that, these sort of online telecontinents are very volatile, and ideas can zip around the world extremely quickly, and solidarities can be very strange in how they work. And they can be orthogonal to left-right divide sometimes, in a way that can be problematic. But just look at what happened in Chile, you know, one of the most stable countries in Latin America. Neoliberalism is a huge success. The majority are excluded from politics, and then an issue starts up, and it's just one issue. I think it was public transport fares. And that just taps into something, the felt unfairness and everything else. And suddenly there's 2 years of social explosion, and they get Gabriel Boric in power. And, you know, obviously that's the beginning of a process, not the end. But what I'm saying is ideas, you know, and memes have a strange potency, particularly given the sort of degeneration and breakdown of traditional political systems. I would expect there to be pop-up forms of internationalism. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like momentary coalitions. They might be a bit transient, but out of them we can start to construct stable things. We just have to be light-footed and adaptable and ready to jump on an opportunity and not too doctrinaire about it and not sectarian, and recognize that in addition to a world ecology we live in, we have an ecology of organizing in which there has to be diversity.
Thank you.
¿Puedo aplaudir?
Si haces preguntas, mejor todavía.
En un momento.
Sí, o sea, sí. Idealmente, si alguna chica, alguna mujer que quiere preguntar, tampoco
va a tener preferencia. ¿No?
Perdón, gracias por el texto, la verdad que ha sido muy inspirador. Yo te quería preguntar, a raíz de lo que has comentado de la tecnología, la geoingeniería, y yo soy de formación biotecnólogo, yo estudié biotecnología, y me gustaría preguntar si hay verdadera esperanza en la tecnología como punto que nos ayude simultáneamente a decrecer y a avanzar a una sociedad más justa. Porque siempre está el fantasma del tecnooptimismo, donde confiamos en soluciones mágicas, en robots que van a recolocar la luna y a enfriar los océanos y a producir hielo. Y es cierto que yo en mi carrera he aprendido a que hay soluciones, podemos estudiar soluciones, la naturaleza, para adaptar soluciones a nosotros, y qué puntos debemos vigilar para no caer en falacias o en soluciones mágicas, o en creer que la tecnología verdaderamente tiene la clave para todo, sin influir negativamente en aspectos sociales, en justicia social, en economía social, en no, digamos, destrozar algunos de los esquemas que tienen que ir parejos a esa ciencia. Muchas gracias.
I think I agree with the way you framed this. I think that whenever anybody, particularly politicians, move to technology too quickly, they're trying to bypass the political issue. They're trying to pretend the political issue has already been settled. And more generally, like in this sort of psychoanalytic register of Lacan and so on, there's a term, talk about the discourse of the university. And the discourse of the university is the discourse of bureaucracy, of knowledge, of technical wisdom and so on. That's the discourse where we start talking about technology as the solution to problems. And Lacanians would always tell you that behind that discourse is always a discourse of mastery. In other words, somebody must know what the right thing to do is, must know what the priorities are, must know who matters and who doesn't. Okay? So as soon as they start talking about technology as the answer, technology for what? For whom? Technology automates human purposes. There's a sort of naive belief on parts of the left that technology is neutral. Chomsky once famously said, hammer doesn't care whether you use it to bang a nail or bash somebody's head in. Well, that's true, But technologies are instruments of social relations, and they're designed to offer a range of possible affordances, and they have political connotations or consequences. For example, nuclear power. It's almost impossible to have nuclear power run in a democratic way, because nuclear power requires hierarchies of secrecy and control. Whereas renewable energy requires, I wouldn't say necessarily democratic control, it can be controlled democratically, but it requires sort of systems that basically are a bit transversal. They cut across national boundaries and so on. So different forms of technology will give you different political options, and that's why we should think about that. Can technology offer some sort of solution? I bloody well hope so, because there's a number of things we know. One, it's already, you know, we've already started the apocalypse, as it were. And as Maurice Blanchot famously put it, the apocalypse is disappointing. It's just the same old shit, but worse. You know, there are some things we're going to need technology for. So you talked about degrowth. 100%. The idea that we can consume as much as we consume, I mean, this we is obviously artificial, but the idea that the most affluent people on the planet can consume what has been consumed until recently is untenable. The idea that we're going to continue to grow in economic terms, if even for the global south to reach the same level of development as the global north, would require that the world's economy grow 6 times. That's a statistic from a few years ago, so it may have changed now. But the point is, it would require a lot of growth, meaning a lot of material throughput, a lot of carbon emissions, a lot of ecological destruction, mass extinction. That's crazy. So somehow, the overdeveloped world has to find ways to restrict consumption. There are ways in which we can do that. Renewable energies do offer some help here. So for example, we could achieve, in principle, 100% renewables. It's not going to happen, but in principle we could, by restricting, this is a study based in the UK, restricting energy usage to about 60% of what it is today, and that's for 2030. Well, okay, that's a hard thing to achieve, but the good thing about it is that energy, like electricity is a lot more energy efficient than coal. Renewable energies are quite efficient, and there can always be advances in energy efficiency, and it can be done in a way that doesn't reproduce what's called the Jevons paradox, which you probably know about. The more efficient you make energy, the more we use it. No, we can politically manage that in different ways, but we can only do that provided we've started to democratize the whole system, and that is the most fundamental thing that I think that we've got to confront. The fact is that we should be having emergency meetings in every town centre, in every city hall, every week, to be working out what the answers to these problems are, because they affect all of us, because dealing with it will require radical changes in our living conditions, in the way we travel, in what we eat, and so on. And also because there's no solution that doesn't involve mass buy-in from everybody. And so, you know, and also because that's where we're most likely to get a serious solution. So that would be where I would start. And then we can, you know, talk about how technologies can be of use to a new democracy. Or even, if we're including our non-human friends in this, our new zoopolis.
Buenas tardes. Yo también os animo a participar, especialmente a vosotras. No hace falta que sea nada desarrollado, como vais a comprobar ahora. Así que os animo. ¿Qué opinas de la creación de los nuevos sindicatos de grandes cadenas, de grandes multinacionales como Amazon, Starbucks? ¿Y qué relevancia política tienen respecto a este proletariado digitalizado? Es decir, que por mucho que nosotros teoricemos y tengamos ciertas certezas sobre cómo se van a comportar los trabajadores o cómo el capital quiere a los trabajadores. Este tipo de hechos creo que sirven, son en cierta forma inesperados y sirven para provocar un efecto en cadena que no hemos previsto. Entonces, un poco como pensar ahí un espacio para el optimismo y ya está.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing about Amazon, the Amazon workers' unions, I mean, it's very interesting how this worked, because the entire basis of their grievance comes out from the digitalization of their labor. You know, the fact that every movement is controlled and surveyed and monitored. They are run off their feet, and they don't have urination breaks. They're having to pee into a bottle. You know, it's sort of modern sweatshop conditions, but in a labour market where that actually constitutes an improvement. So ironically, their ability to unionize did not derive from them having the worst conditions, because a lot of the people who didn't vote for the union, if you remember back in, was it Bessemer or something like that? The one where it failed last year, Bessemer? Somebody, anyway, never mind. Basically, there was another big attempt to build a union. A lot of the workers who voted against it were younger workers who didn't remember what a union was like, never seen a picket line, could only think that it would be bad news for them, because as far as they were concerned, $15 an hour, which is what Amazon was offering, plus certain career possibilities, because Jeff Bezos has that power to offer these things, was a lot better than going and working for your local bodega, or working casual jobs. But so that was the sort of dialectic there. On the one hand, they were empowered because they were collectivized in unexpected ways, and because this new Taylorism required their collectivization, even as it tried to keep them disorganized by controlling their movements so that they would never even encounter another worker while they're on their journey. But that empowered them. At the same time, it also acted as a potential impediment. The real problem that we're going to face is we can't generalize that model, because the future growth of the world proletariat is happening, first of all, in highly informal zones, like, for example, in Egypt or Morocco. A lot of the people doing moderation for Facebook will be doing it for next to nothing in internet cafes or whatever. That's the digital proletariat too, and they can't organize in that way. Then, of course, there's a growing, Mike Davis has written about this, the planet of slums, the growth of slums as places where the informal proletariat is going to live in the future. That's where, of course, ironically, climate change is going to hit harder. Actually, there's nothing ironic about that, it's just utterly predictable. How does one get organized there? One possible source of optimism is that in Bolivia, they managed to respond to the neoliberal restructuring of the workforce, which basically, what the deal is. They break up these big centralized plants, they move them out of town, they have smaller workforces, more flexible workforces, it's harder to organize. The union set up shop in the town centers and said, you can join, even if you're not in the workforce or whatever, you can join and we will still defend you. And they built up working class identities that way and capacity to resist, and that became a vital basis for the sort of the Bolivian uprising of 2005. So there are models that we can learn from. And I think that it will have to be a combination of traditional things like the recent Amazon union building, Starbucks union building, and and other things. But the good thing about this is that in the United States, this is part of a wave that's been happening for some time. You can even trace it back to the mid-2000s, just slow build-up of small successes. That's how it works. If you know about the logic of social contagions, the logic of diffusion is the S-curve. It starts like this, starts to take off, and that's where we're at. We're just at that point of takeoff. So we might see some interesting things happen in a few years. So no, I'm not against optimism. What I would be against is unearned optimism or forced optimism, where you have to think everything's, you know, great. And like, I come from a political culture where, you know, everybody had to be optimistic. It was always going to be 1968 next year, you know, that kind of thing. That's demoralizing in its own way. So optimism, or at least hope, you know.
Sí, no, me permito yo mismo, me doy a mí mismo la palabra, ya, total, ya me lo aviso. Sí, luego ya pues repetimos. Un tema que, no sé, sobre el que me gustaría preguntarte es un poco sobre la situación actual, digamos, post-COVID, post-pandemia, post, entre comillas, pero bueno. ¿Hasta qué punto consideras que podemos hablar de que estamos entrando o estamos ya en una fase post-neoliberal hasta cierto punto, que es algo de lo que a veces se escribe, ¿no? Por lo menos la Unión Europea parece que ya ha dejado de ser el tabú que era hasta hace muy poquito, grandes inversiones estatales, grandes inversiones en distintos proyectos. Bueno, ¿hasta qué punto crees que esto puede ser estable en el tiempo? O sea, que estemos en un ciclo distinto, por lo menos en Unión Europea, Estados Unidos, no sé, Reino Unido, y qué impacto puede tener esto a la hora de la organización. Por lo menos mi experiencia en los últimos años en España, que siga habiendo recortes, por supuesto, no quiero decir que de repente estemos en una especie de nuevo keynesianismo, ni mucho menos, pero hasta qué punto puede haber una diferencia de fase económica y si eso puede tener alguna implicación eso, a la hora de organizarnos, igual viniendo de una época en la que tenemos que estar muy a la defensiva contra recortes del estado de bienestar, etcétera. Si crees que ahora puede haber algún tipo de cambio o si vamos a ver una mezcla de recortes a la vez, digamos un estado de bienestar que se va recortando a la vez que haya grandes inversiones en otro, pues por ejemplo con la excusa, ¿no? Este New Deal de la Comisión Europea para la transición ecológica y eso.
I think when we're at moments of transition, you rarely get a pure, clean break. So when the post-war Keynesian settlement was broken, certain Keynesian ideas continued to persist, certain social democratic ideas that survived, some things survived even throughout the whole neoliberal era. We're at the outset of a new cycle now. Could last another 40 years, we don't know, but in which I would suggest that the dominant tendency will be right Keynesianism, not left Keynesianism, meaning that there will be certain survivals of neoliberalism in terms, particularly the stuff that Foucault was interested in, the management of subjects, the setting up of incentives to think of yourself as an entrepreneur, but also combined with neo-nationalism, with the idea that citizenship derives from being a patriot, a national, and so on, with all the sort of reanimated exclusionary politics that entails. And it will involve a certain expansion of state capacities, but if you look at the way in which nationalist forces have either tried or succeeded in implementing these kinds of policies like infrastructure projects, these tend to be extremely nepotistic and corrupt You know, they're paying off sectors of capital, they're just transferring large amounts of public money. You go and build something for us. Oh, and by the way, while you're doing it, put my name on it. That's Modi's strategy. That was also Boris Johnson's strategy when he was the mayor of London, and I think he would like to do that now. You know, like he wants some big building project that says Boris on it. And, you know, I mean, this is a standard thing on the new nationalist right because of the way in which it's linked up to a certain kind of celebrity politics. You know, that's not going to be the kind of Keynesianism that is about alleviating poverty or suffering, or that is about, for example, strengthening the bargaining power of workers, or that is about increasing the resources that working class communities have to, you know, organize among themselves, cope with their problems, or anything like that. That said, the mere fact that the market, you know, this metaphysical conception of the market is being denaturalized, the mere fact that the state is, you know, has come back into play, as if it ever went away. But, you know, the mere fact that we're allowed to acknowledge now the state has this tremendous power, and the fact that we can see it has a broader range of options has legitimized certain options. The Green New Deal is one example of this. You know, I mean, I know that it's, you know, it means any number of things, but the very fact that you can say, you can talk about seriously about an option that involves, you know, public ownership of some industries, transfer of wealth, you know, shutting down some industries, suppressing fossil fuels in a manageable way, etc. That's hopeful. Basically what it means is that a lot of questions that were depoliticized for a long time are now politicized. Now that can lead to eco-fascism, can lead to green nationalism, but, you know, we're not without agency in this. We have some role, and, you know, I would say that given recent events, not just in Spain, you know, which has been very volatile, or in Portugal with the left bloc, or in the UK with Corbyn's rise and fall, or, you know, whatever, Sanders and all the rest of it. We're in a strange sort of situation where opportunities are just going to blow up, and, you know, what we make of them will somewhat dictate the character of the cycle that we're going through. But I would say the dominant forces are probably going to be nationalist, and we have to adjust our organizing on that basis. Above all, to stress the internationalist and anti-racist character of what we're doing.
Cuando hablamos de cambio climático, de justicia social, todo esto, realmente lo que necesitamos son soluciones globales. ¿Hasta qué punto crees que es importante la ley, y más concretamente la ley penal, criminalizar todo este tipo de conductas, siendo como es una herramienta del sistema, pero quizá como solución un poco más inmediata, más rápida?
Okay. No, so I think, I mean, I have no problem with using the law to punish polluters and to protect, you know, like in Bolivia they have the Pachamama laws that protect the rights of nature. Now, in the European context, the rights of nature has a very dark history associated with nationalism, Volkish anti-Semitism and so on. But in that context it can mean other things, and generally speaking it means that the law will punish people who pollute the river, you know, and that means that there's a whole ecosystem that's being protected by the law. I recognize, look, there's an argument to be had over what is the law. Is the law, you know, essentially between equal rights forced decides? You know, this is the, you know, traditional sort of Marxist argument. You have an apparatus of rights, and you know, essentially they're formally equal, but force decides, and therefore the ruling class usually wins. The law is a tool of the ruling class. That's one way of looking at it. But I think that historically the law's been a lot more complicated than that, and I take sort of Palancian view of the state. You know, Nikos Palantzis would famously say, the state is a form-determined condensation of the balance of class forces. He was very pithy in this way. In this context, what that means is that the law is established through social and political struggle and will always bear the imprint, the register of those struggles. So, for example, you know, how would we have overthrown segregation and Jim Crow without the use of the law and the courts and so on? I think that we can be, in this sense, inside and against the state. You know, there's no outside the state, actually. You know, wherever you are, even if you're operating a sort of autonomous commune, you know, you are part of the state. The state has infiltrated you in various ways, it's educated you, and it controls that territory. And so your ability to exist in that way. So there's no outside the state. So therefore, we can't be purist about this. We're all up to our necks in it. And so I would say, what we want, although punishment is not necessarily always the best way to deal with it, I think that a punitive approach to capital wouldn't be such a bad thing. You know, if you pollute the river or if you overheat our planet, you may go out of business. You know, you can't do business if you're going to do this. That's a starting point. Obviously, in the long run, we want to overthrow them and seize control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, but we're not there yet.
I'll try in English, so I kind of structure it in my head and try to do it easier because I don't have it very clear. But I see in a certain optimistic way that climate change and climate crisis can be also like a point where struggle comes from, or where we come together in order to go against system capitalism, put it in any way. But at the same time, I see we've been through a process of digitalization, possibility of escaping, or the rooting somehow, that we are not connected anymore to our own territory, that kind of makes me feel uncertain about this. If even though climate change affects the place where we live, how can we feel it's something that is going against us if we are not connected to that territory anymore? I think it's happened in El Mar Menor in Murcia in Spain, that it's a very fragile ecosystem. The source of pollution is very clear. I mean, everyone sees it, and at the same time, because it's touristic place from the 60s, somehow people don't feel it's their territory anymore, and I don't know, it's not a focus of struggle against the system anymore, no? Or at least there's that fear that I have. Sorry if it's not very clear, but
no, I follow that, and I see where that fear is coming from, because one of the things about digitalization of daily life is that we come to inhabit a simulacrum. You know, I wrote about this in the Twittering machine, and one of the things that occurs to me when I think about this is how much of our social lives is now conducted online, and how much of our social interactions are not conducted face to face, but through the medium of systems designed by technologists in Northern California who are committed to the values of that scene, you know, hierarchy, celebrity, status, and so on. They want us to behave in that way. They set up the whole protocols so that we behave in that way. And it's a great, you know, Twitter and Facebook and so on are great publicity and marketing machines, they're not so great for having a social life, but that's increasingly how social life is being conducted. Well, if you inhabit a simulacrum, basically an order of images that you're producing as you're typing or as you're scrolling, it seems obvious to me that that can weaken your connection to the world beyond the simulacrum. I mean, Baudrillard would say there is no world beyond the simulacrum. You're kidding yourself. But I happen to think that there is. You know, but it certainly, if you think about those communities of the lone wolfish on 8chan and various other message boards who would respond to a mass shooting by sharing the latest manifesto, you know, trying to make it go viral, deliberately knowing that's the strategy. The killing is a mechanism for the distribution of the message, which is usually fascist kitsch. Okay, what does that say about them? They're extremely antisocial in terms of their culture. They're anons. If you share an emotion, you're trolled for it. If you expose any weakness, you're trolled for it. They're ruthlessly sadistic with one another, but that's where they can relate to anybody else because they've got a problem relating to people in the outside world. And if that tends, I mean, that's an extreme manifestation of something that's generally the case, that people turn to machinery, robots, when there's something problematic in their relations with people in the outside world. And that wasn't caused by technology. It started before technology. I think it's more culturally rooted, particularly in the version of capitalism that we have now. So there's a danger that you know, people having less and less to do directly with the natural environment, with the ecosystem of which they're a part, and come to imagine that they can inhabit an entirely virtualized world without consequences. And there's a certain omnipotence fantasy built into that. You know, I'm invulnerable in here because, you know, as an anon, I'm always wearing the mask of trolling. I'm always ironizing. I'm always attacking somebody. I'm never vulnerable myself. I'm not part of this networked world of dependencies. So I think that's a real worry. I just don't know what the answer is because I don't want to go down the route of moral panic. I don't want to become a Mary Whitehouse of the left. I think we need these technologies one way or another. I think it's partly, maybe the answer is how do we relate to them? So we can start with ourselves on the left, broadly speaking. How do we relate to these technologies? And I would say try as far as possible to professionalize your relationship with it. In other words, make sure it's not using you, because they're set up to be addictive. They don't know what's addictive about it, but it seems to be addictive in some way. So find a way not to be addicted to it. Find a way not to conduct your social life on there. Find a way not to splurge your secrets on there. If you were going on as a Spanish state broadcaster, you wouldn't start talking about your relationships or, you know, like your depression last year or whatever. You would keep it short and to the point. Use the medium. Don't let it use you. And I think if we start like that, we can hopefully, you know, build this ethic and share it, and maybe that will help us somewhat. But I think ultimately, you know, people have to go and work in the real world anyway, and you know, there will always be something that connects you to that world, so it's not straightforward.
Buenas. Suerte traduciéndome. Que, a ver, es decir, voy a bajar el nivel de la conversación muchísimo, ¿vale? Eso es lo primero que voy a decir. Felicidades al equipo de Contra el Diluvio, porque cada vez que he comentado con mi gente cercana el tema del taller de Espacio que ganar, todo el mundo me ha dicho, ¿pero qué espacio? ¿El espacio? ¿El espacio exterior? Todo el mundo, sistemáticamente, ¿vale? Aquí ahora mismo estamos haciendo cohetes para... bueno, lo que queramos. Entonces, lo que quiero decir con esto es que me han encantado muchas preguntas, sobre todo el tema de la digitalización, ¿no? Pero cuando yo he hablado con tanta gente de tantas edades, yo como podéis ver, no soy madrileño, como muchos de aquí, porque Madrid es España, España es Madrid, lo que sea, estamos todos de todas partes. Entonces, cómo resignificar es decir, cómo conseguir que el espacio físico, el parque donde me sollaba las rodillas, vuelva a ser un espacio para ¿cómo traducirlo? Donde me hacía daño las rodillas, sea otra vez para la gente que no, ¿vale? Es decir, la pregunta es totalmente abierta, ¿vale? Porque puede ser un poco... Pero para la gente que ya no lo entienda así, ¿vale? Los niños del COVID que han vivido más en Internet, ¿qué podemos hacer desde la sociedad, desde nosotros? Los estados, si les diese por hacer algo, para que el espacio volviese a ser el espacio y volver a pelearlo al estilo de las superislas de Barcelona. Y seguía por ahí, pero bueno, creo que me entendéis el tema, ¿no? ¿Qué podemos hacer como equipo para que el espacio físico vuelva a ser el predominante y no el online? Perdón por el...
I guess part of this, I mean, I have thoughts about this as an individual, as a citizen, what I would do for myself, but if we're talking on a communal and social level and a civic level, I think part of the problem is that space has been taken over. And, you know, the town centre increasingly resembles an airport in that it's designed so that you buy. It's designed so that you can't sit down anywhere comfortably, because if there's somewhere that you can sit comfortably, a homeless person might be able to sleep there, and you don't want that. So there's a whole sort of city designed for people's discomfort, to keep you restlessly moving along to the next shop. And of course, you know, like something as simple as having toilets available. Quite important for some people, obviously. You know, if you've got IBD or whatever, you need to have access to the toilets. But more generally, the fact that toilets, which used to be everywhere and were free, suddenly there's not toilets available, and if you want to use the toilet, you have to go into a shop and buy something. Ridiculous. So they've taken your space away from you. You know, it used to be this stuff was public possession, and then sometime in the 1980s, politicians started to say, hey, do you know what, you can buy a share of this? What do you mean buy a share of it? That's mine. Well, but you can buy a share of it, and then you'll own it. I already own it, it's mine. This space belongs to us. So the question is, how can we organize to start to reclaim this space? It seems to me that sometimes the middle class in these societies are, because they're more mobilized, they're actually better at protecting their shit. Like they're better at protecting green spaces around them, because they get out and they go down to the council, they march down actually, and they're extremely assertive about their interests. Well, maybe you know, we've lost some of that, you know, some working class militancy. We've lost a lot of the organizing, but I think we need to think about, if we want to give people a chance to get out of the sort of virtual space, we have to deal with the reasons what drove them into the virtual space. There's all sorts of things. I just, you know, mentioned the encroachment on public space by corporations and by neoliberal town councils and administrations who basically, you know, sell out to them because that's the only way in which they can organize things these days. But let's not forget also, you know, there's things like libraries. One of the reasons why people turn to the internet for free stuff is because libraries were being shut down left and right. Youth centers, okay, well, I'll go on the internet and, you know, get some quasi-legal drugs from eBay or whatever, and that will be my social life. You know, the fabric of daily life has been shut down and commodified as far as possible. Even work, you know, like the idea of, you know, that you might be able to go to somewhere and reliably get a decent job where it's relatively stable and you can live on it. Well, you can't really do that anymore. So why don't you go on to TaskRabbit and sign up as a you know, a task worker, and, you know, maybe why don't you, if you got a car, okay, so why don't you sign up to Uber and then drive around whenever they tell you to, and it won't be, you know, you'll supplement your income. So in other words, we're being driven into these digitized spaces that are set up to exploit us, that are set up to use our time, even when we're not supposedly working. You know, when you're on Twitter, you're being exploited because you're working for them. we have to deal with what's driven us into those virtual spaces. But at the same time, also, I would like to say, you know, maybe we could rekindle the technological utopianism as well. I don't think it's a bad thing for us to have virtual spaces. I like the idea of having virtual reality and being able to do almost anything in it. What I don't like is the idea that Jaron Lanier has been warning about, which is that in order for this to work, they're going to require more and more data from us, and they're going to use it to control our experience and to, you know, like to control our lives in more and more ways. No, I think we need to take back control also of the means of virtual production, and that's a long one.
Bueno, yo tengo dos preguntas bastante diferenciadas. La primera se refiere a una idea que ha aparecido en las dos intervenciones anteriores, que preguntaban por la posibilidad de conectar con nuestros espacios, con nuestros entornos, con nuestro medio ambiente. Y se abría a partir de ahí la pregunta de si estuviésemos más conectados con nuestros espacios, con nuestros entornos, no produciría las catástrofes climáticas, la desertización, lo que nos toque a cada uno, un movimiento emancipatorio, como si de algún modo el reconectar con nuestros espacios fuese a generar esos movimientos emancipatorios. Y quería preguntarte si no crees que en ocasiones caemos en un cierto optimismo, que no creo que esté mal, creo que ese tipo de cosas de recuperar tejido social, conectar con nuestros espacios, etcétera, son cosas positivas por sí mismas, pero si en ocasiones no caemos en un cierto optimismo al pensar que van a llevar a un movimiento emancipatorio. Y el otro día Emilio Santiago Muiño, que hablará en la última charla, hablaba de esto y ponía el ejemplo de un terremoto puede ser leído como un movimiento de las placas tectónicas que produce un grave temblor y destruye nuestras ciudades, o puede ser leído como un castigo divino. Es decir, no necesariamente tiene por qué llevar el conectar con nuestro entorno y con nuestros medioambientes y las catástrofes climáticas a un movimiento emancipatorio. Puede llevar a cualquier otra cosa. Esa es la primera pregunta. Si quieres, luego hago la siguiente. Porque no tiene mucho que ver.
Okay. All right, so I'll answer the first and then you come back with the second. So I agree with you that there's a kind of, there's a danger, at least, of succumbing to a kind of romantic idea that if we only overcome our alienation, you know, and reconnect, then, you know, we will restore a kind of organicity, a kind of a totality, a holism that will motivate us to deal with the planetary issues that we're facing. Obviously, that's not adequate in itself. I wouldn't say you're going to solve the world's problems by getting out more and meeting your friends. I would say you should probably get out more and meet your friends, because that's a good thing for you. You'll be happier doing that. You'll get more out of it. And also, as a consequence, you will not be shriveling in a small room where you can't do anything and you feel impotent, and you retreat into fantasies of omnipotence, you know. So, you know, it's a condition for, you know, one's general development and so on, but it's not the emancipatory solution. The other thing is, of course, you know, getting out and seeing nature. I mean, we're culturally sophisticated enough to know by now that sometimes when people go out and see nature, nature shits all over them. You know, think about Withnail and I going off to the countryside, you know, and getting rained on, and a bull runs after them and everything goes wrong. But that's nature for you, you know. As soon as you start to romanticize Mother Nature, she sneezes some COVID-19 in your face. You know, or she carries out a mass extinction every 26 million years or something like that. So, you know, obviously there's that intrinsic problem. Still, Still though, I can't speak for everybody, but I can say that for myself, one of the most curative things that I did over the last few years was to visit nature, as it were, as if nature is ever gone, but to get out of the ordinary, to get out of the humdrum run of things where everything is designed for utility, for capitalist utility in particular, and to connect with a dimension of experience that is planetary, and to try and cultivate a planetary sensibility. So it's not just about having the right ideas and being right all the time, which is something that the left can fall into a lot. Well, we're bloody well right. Well, so what if you're impotent and you can't do anything about it? Try and cultivate the right sensibility so that you feel it and it's part of you, so that you expand yourself as a human being. That would be my broad brush answer to that. What was your other question?
La otra pregunta se refería a una tensión que hay en torno a las propuestas del tipo Green New Deal, y quería preguntarte cuál es tu postura o qué crees que debería hacer gente, quiero utilizar un adjetivo amplio, como los que estamos aquí, como nosotros, respecto al Green New Deal. ¿Qué postura debe adoptarse? Porque por un lado tiene problemas evidentes y choca con límites como los que se han señalado aquí. Se ha hablado de la necesidad de decrecimiento y las propuestas del tipo Green New Deal no contemplan esa posibilidad. Siguen contemplando una suerte de business as usual verde y crecimiento que no es solo crecimiento sino encima exponencial, lo cual es un desastre absoluto. Sin embargo, posturas más radicales que contemplan la posibilidad de decrecer no tienen el consenso social, ni el apoyo, ni la capacidad organizativa necesaria para ofrecer una alternativa hoy, ya. Y ocurre que los problemas a los que nos enfrentamos, especialmente si pensamos en términos de calentamiento global y de, por ejemplo, la reducción de las emisiones de CO2 que tendríamos que llevar a cabo, son problemas que requieren un esfuerzo bélico que empiece ayer. Entonces, la pregunta es esa: sobre esta tensión, ¿qué postura crees que debería adoptarse respecto a las propuestas del tipo Green New Deal?
Okay, so our dilemma is that we have a crisis that is of a scale that requires revolutionary action, but we don't have the time for a revolution. We don't have the time to build up the social forces to patiently wait. As Trotsky said, being a revolutionary teaches you patience. Well, we don't have time for that. We've got until 2030 to start the transition for real. I mean, it should have already started. And therefore, we need to think about the means to hand. Now, there are versions of the Green New Deal that are milquetoast, not even reformist. There are versions of the Green New Deal that are nationalist, I mean, just in a narrow sense, very unthinking of the global situation, just reduced to a set of tools that can be used, policy-making tools, but rooted in a kind of Keynesian effort to defend civilization. But I think that there's a good argument, like authors like Alyssa Battistoni from the United States have talked about how essentially what we need is non-reformist reforms. We need we're not going to escape the fact that the Green New Deal is going to drastically increase emissions in the short run. That's going to happen. It's going to set out one final pulse of fossil energy and its byproducts into the atmosphere. But the point is, if we can do this in a way that means we take control of it, we can force ourselves then into a slower groove. Then we can talk about degrowth. Then we can talk about, look, what foods are low carbon? Like apples are low carbon, great, enjoy them. Some other foods are quite high carbon, and therefore we're going to have to price them quite highly, or ban them, or ration them, or something like that. In other words, the Green New Deal can be a transitional instrument. It's not a monument, it's a tool. It is designed to subjectivate people, to cut through a wedge of people and say, you're coming with us, okay? And so that's why it's, in the United States idiom, it had to include a lot of references to indigenous communities who've been resisting the XL pipeline and who, in most parts of the world, have been the ones at the forefront of defending, you know, parts of the natural environment and governing them. I don't want to romanticize this, but it just happens to be the case. So that's why it had to include that. But now it also has to include something about rare metals and rare metal extraction. The People's Republic of China, which is going to be the big polluter in the 21st century, no question about that, is also setting itself up to dominate the world market in rare metals and renewable energies. Now, I would like to believe that this is because they're moving towards, as they put it, ecological civilization, but that's really not the case. It's a particularly corrupt form of state capitalism, and the sort of their way of mining rare metals is extremely environmentally toxic and extremely exploitative of the labor force. Well, any sort of transitional project is going to have an international focus, and it's going to have to say, where are we going to get those rare metals from? Under what conditions? How is that going to be done? There's going to have to be a whole series of questions asked, but the thing is, you know, whenever you get a powerful idea like the Green New Deal, I would say just because there are bad versions of it, don't shit on it. Just use it as a handle. You know, like the Communist Party in the United States in the 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed pro-union acts, legislation, the Communist Party put out literature saying the president wants you to join a union, right? He didn't. He was trying to defend capitalism, but he was trying to, you know, like basically he said, we don't give half the loaf, they're going to take the whole loaf, right? So that's, you know, that was the logic, but the Communist Party understood it wasn't about being abstractly correct, it was about, they give you a handle, turn it. They got people to join the bloody unions and they increased the power of their side. That's how we should be thinking about this. We should be, you know, I think that a lot of sort of left-wing politics is realpolitik for the oppressed. It's, you know, we need to be a bit Machiavellian about this, and that means start with something that sounds innocuous like the Green New Deal, which it can be, and turn it into something that, I mean, this is going to get reproduced in all sorts of right-wing think tanks now. Turn it into something like revolutionary socialism. The Heartland Institute can now broadcast this to their members. Do you see what I'm saying?
Igual es un buen momento para dejarlo aquí.
Is that,
So it's okay to end here.
huh?
I think your last words were perfect for finish to end.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody's a bit tired, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.